Something that needs to be understood right now is that the world you thought you knew, the one where the United States and Canada were essentially two halves of the same economic organism, where you could drive across that northern border without a second thought, where Canadian oil quietly powered American refineries and Canadian steel quietly built American infrastructure, that world is gone. And the moment it left is not some vague point on a distant timeline. It has a specific date, a specific social media post, and a very specific clock attached to it. Let's talk about what actually happened here, because the headline alone, Trump's 12-hour ultimatum, raises the question of whether Canada will pay the price, gives you a title, but not the story. And the story is something that most mainstream coverage is completely failing to explain with the depth it deserves. Go back to the beginning of 2025. Donald Trump had just returned to the White House, and within days, not weeks, not months, but days, he signed executive orders slapping 25% tariffs on all goods from Canada and Mexico, with Canadian oil and energy getting a slightly lower 10% rate. The official justification was fentanyl and border security. But here's what the American public was not told clearly. In the 2024 fiscal year, U.S. customs agents seized 43 pounds of fentanyl at the Canadian border, compared with 21,100 pounds at the Mexican border. That is less than 1% of all fentanyl seized by U.S. border agents coming through Canada. So the fentanyl story was always paper thin when applied to Canada. It was a legal mechanism, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, being used as a container to carry something else entirely. The question was always, what is that something else? And this is where you have to think carefully. Because if you watch what Trump has said about Canada since returning to office, it stops looking like a trade dispute and starts looking like a negotiation over something much larger. He has repeatedly and not quietly suggested that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. He has referred to Canadian leaders as governors. He threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, an estimated $5.7 billion bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, financed almost entirely by the Canadian taxpayer, simply because he had grievances about Canadian trade policy. His own trade representative admitted during a Fox Business appearance that he didn't even know the details of the bridge agreement, but promised there would be a new negotiation simply because, as he put it, the US has a $29 trillion economy and Canada's is between $1 and $2 trillion. That is a statement of raw power. That is not trade policy. That is the language of subordination. Now let's get into the real texture of what has been happening, because it escalated in ways that tell you something profound about where American foreign policy actually is. In June 2025, Canada had a digital services tax, a 3% levy on large technology companies earning revenue from Canadian users, finally come due for its first payment. Under this tax, large technology firms with global revenues exceeding $820 million and Canadian revenues of more than $14.7 million would pay a 3% levy on certain digital services revenues earned in Canada, and unlike traditional corporate taxes based on profits, this tax targeted gross revenues linked to Canadian user engagement. Countries across Europe had already done similar things. It was not radical. It was a sovereign government saying that companies making billions off its citizens should pay some portion of that back into the public purse. A reasonable position by any normal standard of governance. Trump's response was to end all trade discussions with Canada, blaming the country's digital services tax and demanding it be removed before negotiations could begin again. He called it a direct and blatant attack on the United States. Not on the tech companies, on the United States itself. And what happened next is something that every American watching this should sit with quietly for a moment. Canada rescinded its digital services tax, dropping the levy just before it was set to go into effect. The tax that would have collected roughly $3 billion from predominantly American technology giants? Gone. Surrendered. Because Washington demanded it. Now you might hear that and think, well, that's diplomacy, that's compromise, that's how these things work. But ask yourself this. At what point does compromise become capitulation? At what point does a sovereign nation repeatedly backing down under threat start to look like something structurally different from a negotiation between equal partners? Canada's own tech journalists were saying it openly at the time. One prominent Canadian tech commentator told Al Jazeera that Carney's decision to drop the levy showed Trump that Canada can be pushed around. That is a quote from a Canadian analyst about their own government. And it matters because it tells you something about the psychology of power that is operating here. What you're watching in real time is the United States restructuring its relationship with its closest geographic neighbor. Not through war, not through diplomacy in any traditional sense, through the relentless application of economic pressure, Tariffs, threats, ultimatums with ticking clocks, and the constant background hum of annexation rhetoric. The Trump tariffs represent the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993, amounting to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $500 in 2026. Read that again slowly. The tariffs are not just hitting Canada, they are hitting American families directly. Every time a company absorbs a tariff cost and passes it to the consumer, which is what companies do, that family at the checkout line in Ohio or Georgia or Texas is paying more. The tariff is a tax on Americans dressed in the costume of national strength, but let's stay with Canada because the shape of what is happening there is genuinely unprecedented. Canada's economy could enter a recession within 6 months if the tariffs are maintained, according to economic analysis. And the tariffs have not simply been maintained, they have escalated. By August 2025, the tariff on Canadian goods had been raised to 35%. On January 31, 2026, Trump threatened to increase tariffs to 50% and impose additional tariffs on Canadian aircraft if Canada pursued a trade deal with China. Think about the logic of that position for a moment. The United States is telling a sovereign nation it cannot conduct trade relationships with third countries, Canada reaching a modest agricultural and electric vehicle agreement with China, a deal that would see Beijing lower tariffs on canola and other agricultural products in exchange for Ottawa, allowing 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market, was met with a threat to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods, not 25%, not 35%, 100%. And here is where the deeper question lives, because Canada is not a small, powerless nation, it is the United States' largest trading partner. Canada-US trade comprises about 1/3 of Canada's economy, but the relationship is not one-sided. Canada buys more from American businesses than the UK, France, China, and Japan combined. That is an enormous statement. The idea that America can simply apply maximum economic pressure to Canada without consequence to American industries, American workers, American supply chains, that idea does not survive contact with the actual data. The auto industry alone should make this plain to anyone willing to look. Due to decades of free trade agreements, including USMCA, factories in the US, Canada, and Mexico are accustomed to shipping auto parts back and forth multiple times during the manufacturing process. A single car door might cross the border 3 or 4 times before it ends up on a finished vehicle. Every one of those crossings under a tariff regime is a cost that someone pays, and it is not the Canadian government paying it. It is American manufacturers and then American consumers. Economist Arthur Laffer estimated car prices would increase by $4,111 under the tariff regime compared to $2,165 if the USMCA exemption remained available. Thousands of dollars per vehicle, passed directly to American buyers, so when we ask whether Canada will pay the price, we also have to ask who else is paying it. And the honest answer is that American families are paying a substantial portion of it right now in the form of higher prices for cars, steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, and a long list of other goods that move across that northern border every single day. But the political economy of this is the part that most analysis misses, because this is not simply about trade balances or tariff revenues or even fentanyl. Something larger is happening in the architecture of the global order, and the US-Canada relationship is one of the most visible stress points where that larger thing is becoming visible. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has been attempting something strategically significant. Carney has been positioning Canada as a leader among what he calls middle powers, nations that are not the United States or China, but that have enough economic weight and institutional standing to matter in the construction of a new global order. At a rally in Quebec, Carney stated that the era of close economic integration and security cooperation with the United States had ended, calling on Canadians to fundamentally reimagine their economy, dramatically reduce dependence on the United States, and build new trading partnerships elsewhere. That is a remarkable statement from the leader of a country that has been one of America's most loyal allies for the entire post-war period. It is the kind of statement that carries emotional weight in Canada, but it also carries geopolitical weight globally. Other nations are watching. Every country in the world that trades with the United States is watching what happens to Canada. If the most integrated, most historically aligned, most economically intertwined partner of the United States can be subjected to this level of pressure, tariffs stacked on tariffs, ultimatums with countdown clocks, threats to block infrastructure the Canadians themselves built and paid for, then what does that signal to every other country that depends on American market access? It signals that access to the American market is not a relationship, it is a leverage point, and that leverage can be pulled at any moment for any reason, including reasons that have nothing to do with the stated justification. Canada alleged that tariffs on its exports were intended to damage its economy and pressure annexation into the US. A Japanese trade official was quoted saying that no matter who they talked to in the US administration, none of them knew what Trump was thinking, and they didn't even know what he wanted to negotiate on. That is the level of strategic opacity the world's trading nations are operating under right now, and it has consequences that will outlast whatever individual tariff rate happens to be in place on any given week. In February 2025, Canadian travel to the United States dropped by 40% compared to February 2024. A March 2025 poll found that 62% of Canadians plan to avoid traveling to the US for the next year, and American tourism groups worried they would lose Canadian tourist traffic. The shift in Canadian travel away from the US could amount to an annual loss of $4 billion for the US economy. $4 billion in lost tourist spending from one country, because the relationship has been poisoned. Because when people feel like their country is being disrespected, they vote with their feet, or in this case, they stay home and spend their money somewhere else. And those are real businesses in real American cities that depend on Canadian tourists every single year. Buffalo, Detroit, Niagara Falls, Seattle, they are paying that price right now. What is ultimately at stake here is not just whether Canada bends to Trump's tariff demands. What is at stake is whether the architecture of the post-war international economic order, built on rules, on treaties, on the idea that even powerful nations are constrained by agreements they sign, has any remaining operational force. Trump used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law giving the president broad financial power during declared national emergencies, to circumvent the USMCA's tariff restrictions, marking the first time the law was used to impose tariffs. The USMCA was a trade agreement his own administration renegotiated. He signed it, and then he used emergency law to override it. That is not a trade dispute. That is a demonstration that signed agreements mean nothing when the party with the most leverage decides they no longer want to honor them, and the world has noticed. Not just Canada, Europe has noticed, Asia has noticed, the global South has noticed. When the most powerful economy in human history demonstrates that it will walk away from its own signed commitments the moment it suits its domestic political purposes, every other nation on earth has to update its assumptions about what American promises are actually worth. That updating is happening right now. It is happening in trade negotiating rooms, in central bank decisions, in infrastructure investment calculations, in currency reserve choices. The erosion of American credibility as a reliable partner is not a future risk. It is a present reality being priced into decisions being made around the world this year. So when we ask whether Canada will pay the price for Trump's ultimatums, the deeper answer is that the question itself is already outdated. Canada is already paying, Americans are already paying, the global trading system is already absorbing the costs of this rupture. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated the cost of the combined tariffs to the typical American family would be over $200 a year. That is real money. That is a family's grocery budget for a month. That is a car payment. That is a utility bill, paid by American families, justified in the name of American strength. But the strength of a nation is ultimately measured not by how much pressure it can apply to its neighbors, but by whether the system it leads remains one that others want to be part of. What we are watching with Canada is the first chapter of a much longer story. It is the story of an American power that has decided it no longer wants to be bound by the rules of the order it created. And the question that history will ask, the question that your children and grandchildren will read about in whatever textbooks survive this period, is whether that decision made America stronger or whether it simply made America alone.